Welcome, everybody, to the Troubadour Podcast. And today I have Deanna, and we're going to talk about her company, Pizan Academy, where they help provide literature and really, why don't you explain it to us a little bit to help us out? But it's for homeschooling. It's educational courses and guidance for homeschoolers. But why don't you explain a little bit about what Pizan Academy does?
Sure. So Pizan Academy is a curriculum company, and we write curriculum based on classic works of literature. And we provide everything that the parent needs to teach the work to their kids. We focus on middle school and high school. And so one of our things is we tell parents that you don't even have to read the work because we know parents are very busy, often teaching more than one level of homeschooling. And so we provide a summary, quizzes, everything they would need to do a robust teaching of classic novels or literature, poetry, plays, anything in the Western canon.
Okay. That's a lot better. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Curriculum was the word I was looking for. So you help homeschoolers. Now, that's a really big thing right now because a lot of people are doing homeschool for the first time, and some of them are deciding to stay with it, which is cool.
I think so. It is cool. We've heard that. And we have even some friends in our neighborhood who are, because of what's going on with COVID and the schools being shut down, they're, getting a little more involved in their students or their kids' schooling. And it's not that they weren't involved earlier, but now they don't have a choice. The kids are learning at home and the parents are doing a lot more. The parents are home and, I can't even imagine how difficult that is to juggle your full-time job plus helping your kids with their schooling. So it's been interesting, but we've been asked for some feedback and some curriculum, but just some tools that parents can use during this time. And right now, I'm in Washington, and they're even saying in the fall, they may not go back to school up here. And I know it's going to be different in every state.
Wow,
but that's
really?
kind of what they're already having those conversations.
All school district wide, they're not going to go back?
That's what those conversations are saying about what to do in fall.
That's crazy.
It's crazy.
Yeah, that's all of Washington.
That's Washington State Department of Ed that's what they're looking at right now, what to do.
Wow.
Yeah.
I had no idea. That just sounds so shocking.
I know.
I just what are they going to do? So I'm not a huge public school advocate, to be perfectly honest. I was a public school kid. I didn't have a good experience, and I personally like the view of allowing parents and everybody to have more options, more availability, more focus, like you're talking about with paying attention to your kids' education, which I think is something that we all of us don't do very well because we kind of take for granted that it's all being done properly. And, we're like, oh, it's education, and they got education covered over there in the governments. Right. And so I have a little bit of a negative view of that. That's not to say that nothing good ever happens there. I think it does. But what's just astounding to me, though, in that statement is even if I'd be more in favor of, phasing these types of public school out, man, it just happened like on a snap of a button.
I know.
It's like now you're just kind of thrust into this thing. And that's what's really, everybody's scrambling. And I just feel bad for the kids who are going to miss out on, possibly any good education. And that's, you talk about like a year and a half. Maybe it'll be good in the long run. Like they'll be better ready for life or something. I don't know. I wonder what would happen to me if I was like 11 years old, right? And there's no school from 11 to 12, right? There's all at home basically. So.
It's hard to imagine. I also went to public school. I went to public school all the way through my master's degrees. And the first time I went to a private school was when I was getting my doctorate in education. So I was, I didn't know anything else. I went to California State University for my bachelor's and my master's, and that's just, what I did all the way through. And So when I got to my doctor, it was really interesting because first off, it was night and day in terms of the cleanliness and the services. I mean, I was like, whoa. And I was teaching at a community college in Los Angeles when I was getting my doctorate. And so I'd go to, my school for myself, and then I'd come back to teach, and it's like, oh my gosh, everything's so dirty.
But it's definitely more dirty.
Just because of the masses of people and just different, and budgets and all of that. But I had a good education, but I'm like you, I'm not the biggest fan of public education nowadays. While I was getting my doctorate, I was kind of the black sheep in the program because of my ideas. I believe in teaching the classics, and I believe in those dead white guys are worth listening to, which there's been a backlash in education, public education. But I did a pretty big research project on the variances of government education. So what was being taught, say, in California or on the West Coast versus what was taught in the South, just looking at social studies. And then biology. And in the South, some districts have labels on their biology textbooks that say evolution is just a theory. Whereas in California, they've omitted some of the history, the United States history, to be more inclusive to the contributions of like gay people, people of color. And so it's really interesting. There's such a variance. And when the founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they didn't put education in there purposefully. They left that to the states. And this is not that I disagree with that, but this is an unintended consequence of public education, is this sort of political variances, and it is politicized. And your kids are going to learn what is popular politically in that area because, people run for the school board. It's an elected position. It's a lot of times it's a stepping stone to higher political offices. So it's very much political, and that's what I'm against.
It's just an interesting thing. And I think it's so positive that we live in 2020 and there is an option to try to reach kids, to try to reach parents. And, obviously you're not going to reach everybody, but just reaching some people with this kind of education, with the great books. And, I think that there will always be some portion of the society that does read the great books, even if it's a really tiny portion, which I think today it is a very minuscule portion of the whole Western civilization or the whole world that reads much of the great books, that really reads them. Because I'm always wondering about, like I see books on the shelves at Barnes and Noble. I don't even know if they have it, but they have that classic section. And I'm always wondering, like, I wonder how many people just buy it just to buy it, and they don't actually read this big old book, right? Like who
put in
buys
the living room
Plato's
to look like
Republic? Plato's Republic. And it's like, and maybe they read the back and a page, and they don't actually read it because it takes a lot of work. I'm reading for the first time, actually, Milton's Paradise Lost. And I've never read it before. And it's the most difficult thing I've ever read, actually.
It's extraordinary. I haven't finished it. I picked it up over the years and I do little bits at a time. It is very dense. I think reading Dante is much easier than Milton.
Which is interesting because that's a translation, though. That's
right.
So it's easier probably because
of the
translator made it easier.
Yeah, that's true.
We're reading English, and so we're reading it in the original, the way that he wrote it, and it's very challenging. I'm actually, so this goes back to what you and I do with podcasts, with the content that we create, with trying to bring literature, short stories, poetry, social or science, or I guess, do you guys do much with science actually?
We don't do science.
Mostly history and philosophy.
Yeah, right? Well, we had a section where we talked about Archimedes, and so we'll bring it in a historical context. And for middle school, our focus is heroes.
Okay.
And so we will bring in heroes of science in various time periods
that's cool.
to go along with a literary work.
Yeah. I love that.
It's everything is in context. Our first two levels of high school are Man the Thinker. Our last two levels of high school are Man the Rational Thinker. And so everything ties back to these themes, and we use the literature as the main work, but we wrap it in historical context. We wrap it in philosophical context in high school. And within those themes, we're always thinking of heroes. So if we're talking about Ben Franklin, we might have a novel that's set like in an era or an inventor, or like a have spacesuit will travel or something like that. Then we can bring in Ben Franklin, or we can bring in Epaminondas, or some of these older interesting figures throughout history. And so we wrap everything in this kind of context. So it's not just here, teach the literature. It's here, teach the literature and this other wonderful things that kind of reinforces whatever message is coming across.
Yeah, I remember when I was a teacher, for 2 years, I taught 5th and 8th grade, and I really thought it was strange how compartmentalized education was, even at good schools. So I just found it fascinating that there was this science teacher who was a wonderful science teacher, and she was she loved science, she loved kids. I think it was 6th or maybe 7th grade. They were doing aquatic life, and they were doing all this studying of aquatic life. We were in California. They went to, and I got to go with them, Catalina Island. And,
nice.
We got to see all these great things. It was just wonderful, what she did. And I was like, we should, or have you thought of, in science, actually, either assigning or talking about, or even working with literature teacher of your grade in reading 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea and by Verne, because, a lot of people, we all know about Nemo, and not Little Nemo, but Captain Nemo.
Right.
And, his, what was his ship's name? I can't remember the name of his ship. But his submarine, that big old thing underwater.
Is it the Nautilus?
Yeah, I think so. And he, what people I think forget about that book, if they ever read the short story, it's really kind of like a novelette, I guess.
Yeah.
Is it's so descriptive of underwater life, of fish, not just humans, but just like seeing all this thing, and it's describing it all, and you get to see it and a lot of it's just flat out description, and they're describing what different animals look like, or different fish look like, what different crabs look like, different plant life looks like down there. And it just, I don't know, it's like this gorgeous look down using words, and it's just another way to kind of solidify this world. But they, literature teachers didn't teach it even when the science teacher was teaching that, which made no sense to me. They were teaching something that had nothing to do with what they were covering. And I like that you guys have a kind of integrated, we're going to cover heroes. So we're going to do science heroes, and then we're going to do, these kind of heroes, and although there might be some limits to that, I think it's a really good way that there should be some collaboration, right?
Right.
Or at least that's
the
seems
thing.
Like there should be.
Yeah. I mean, education is so siloed. This is my discipline, this is what I do, and I don't do that. And so I taught humanities when I taught college, and I had a background in archaeology, anthropology, history, art history, and it wound me up in humanities, which was great because I could bring in all of these things. Yeah. I can bring in a little bit of the science. I could talk about, Ada Lovelace, and I could talk about these incredible people that were just not only writers or only musicians. So math is all over music. And so you can integrate, and that's how education should be. And that's one of our main sort of formulas is we don't want to, say we brand ourselves as a literature company, but we're literature plus. We're not just literature. You're going to learn how to write. You're going to be a stronger thinker. You're going to learn why people make these decisions in these books, what drives humans. And so we really do a deeper dive. And I think that's what is missing is integration of thought and ideas. And, STEM is considered the most valuable thing on the planet right now. And I think what's lacking, literature, that's just something if you, do on the side, or that's just what elitists do. They read, highbrow literature, but it's, we always talk about it around here as being the most practical thing you can do as a human is to read this literature.
Yeah. And I want to, so that's a good, jumping off point to something I was hoping to talk to you about that we're both very passionate about, and the value of literature itself, because I think it's very disconcerting to me, the kind of society that we live in. And it's in terms of the ability to take a moment to reflect on something before we react to it. And there's just so much, anger and thoughtlessness. And it seems like, and more than just thoughtlessness, but also the quickly tossing other people under the bus without thinking about what they have to say, not taking other people's positions and understanding them. And there's just so much confusion. It's all split. And, it's like, I can understand those types of anger in a kind of uneducated 16th century, nobody knew how to read except for 1% of the population. But we live in the most literate, if we define literacy as it is, being able to read at a very low level, and I know that sounds insulting, but I've taken a very harsh view to literacy. I don't think most of us are very literate, to be honest. If it's impossible for you to pick up William Wordsworth, right, or Coleridge, or even Milton, and get something out of it, then are you literate? It's like, can you if I picked up Homer in the original Greek, it would be all Greek to me. I'm not literate in that. I can't read that.
Exactly.
And if you pick up, 90% of, the works in English, and it's nothing to you, then it's like that English is another language to you. You can't you can't really speak it or understand it in a literary way. You might be able to speak it, but not read it. Anyway, so there's this case that's going on that I'm going to bring in a current event to kind of make how I think literature is practical. And maybe we can talk about this a little bit. And it's something that is very, very, like I said earlier, disconcerting and challenging to me as a human, and probably to all of us. And it's the case of the young woman who was walking her dog without a leash, and a black gentleman called her out and told her not to do it. And then, that it's illegal. And then she's supposed to and then she called the cops on him, and then he took video of it, and then he sent it out, and it went viral, and she lost her job, and everybody hates her. And, my reaction was I don't know why she had to call the cops on him. I don't know. That was my first reaction. But having read a lot of literature, like, one value that it gives you is always like, this isn't a complete story, right? If I'm reading this is chapter preface, right? We're barely getting into this story. So why was everybody, there were people sending death threats to her, and it's like,
I know.
And it's like, well, hold on, maybe she deserves it. I don't know. Maybe she's a monster and I don't know it. And that's going to be chapter 75, and we're going to get to that. Right. And we're going to see or maybe it'll be chapter 13. And part of it is like how to get rid of this monster in society. I don't know. But, I see that. And it's like, I can't imagine somebody who's actually trained in literature, even slightly, not professionally, but just gets a real training in literature, and seeing that and saying, like, hold on, what else is going on? Because as the story progresses, and we just saw this before, or I saw this before our recording, which is why I'm thinking about it, is a couple revelations came out. One, the gentleman is actually like a popular activist, right? So he's like actively looking for things, is one thing.
Right.
And then he started calling for people to stop, attacking her so much. And, there's, maybe she was wrong. Maybe she was scared. I mean, there's a lot to it. The point is, there's multiple sides to understanding, and, to multiple perspectives is the cliche in literature. And that is the lesson. And a lot of people throw that word around, and they don't seem to really grasp what it means to have perspective. So I just want to, start by talking about literature and, what your thoughts are on the value of it as a human. Right.
Well, I mean, I I've been a fan of literature and what you would probably call like the great books as long as I can remember. I was reading junior classics as a kid. I Shakespeare, by the time I got to high school, I had read everything that was already being assigned. For some reason, Shakespeare came easy to me, and I know it's very difficult for a lot of people, but I got it.
It is
I'm
for me.
lucky.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
But I
I
like
know I'm just
Shakespeare too.
and I realized that. So when I was teaching, I had to find out, ways that I could teach my students to understand it. And reading aloud is the best way. Whether you're reading it to yourself, your dog, someone else, reading it with a scene partner, whatever, read Shakespeare aloud. It makes it come alive. So things like that. But literature per se, I mean, there's all of these stories dating back over 2,000 years that have played out human scenarios. And I always would tell my students, we don't do anything new. We're just reinventing the same things over and over again, repackaging it and selling a new movie or selling a new book. But all of these human experiences we can read about and we can look at how people deal with things. This person, that character did that, and this is what happened. That may not be the best course of action. Or, you know what, I read this book and I thought I knew everything going on, but the author surprised me. And there was this subtext that I didn't even get. So now I know to look for things a little bit differently. And there are, heroes we can emulate and cautionary tales that we know to avoid. So I think that just by reading it, we become better humans and we learn and how to deal with other people. And, you were talking about the kind of divide, and tribalism is kind of the word that gets thrown around. And I think that's true. People are like, I belong to this, so I just shut down my brain and I just go with the flow. But if you're well read, it teaches you to think and it teaches you to observe and to try to understand people like you would try to understand the characters in a book.
Yeah. And by the way, I agree with all that. The pushback is, and what well, what were our challenges, Deanna and Kirk, like our big challenge, and people like us, the 5 or 6 other people on the planet like us. Our challenge is that I don't think people would disagree with that in a theoretical standpoint, right? Like a lot of people would say, yeah, if you have the time or you have this, special education, not special, sorry, that's not right. Yeah. But if you're educated in a special way and you have that, capacity to get it, then great. That's then go for it. But it's more for like, it's drawing rooms. It's enjoyable to talk about.
Right.
It's something
it's highbrow.
And it's like, but I'm trying to build a business and I don't need to have this kind of, taking time to write literature. It's not practical in the sense that it adds necessarily to your material values. And in fact, you often see examples of lots of times we see examples of pursuing literature, pursuing the arts is antithetical to pursuing material, like to become really wealthy. Like you don't, for every J.K. Rowling, there's 500,000 artists who starve and don't make it and don't make any money at all. And so it's like, what's the value of getting this if you're going to, die starving in the streets if you're pursuing the arts, right?
Well, I think the value, there are tech companies that are talking about not being able to find people that can write emails or that can interact in a group setting because they're so focused on STEM and they're brilliant in those fields. And, there have been articles that have been published with, leaders in the tech industry saying, hey, we can teach people how to code. You can't teach people how to interact with other humans. And that's what literature does.
Yeah.
And that's what reading does. The authors and artists, they express things in these sort of beautiful, but also in very economic ways. They're very particular how they write or how they create. And if we're reading literature and we're reading a wide breadth of literature, particularly the classics, there's a wide breadth of classics. Mm-hmm. And I think they're better. Now, honestly, I read modern contemporary chick lit really lighthearted stuff before I go to bed, because I'm running a company. We're a startup and I'm working 12, 13-hour days, and it shuts my brain down. So I'm not always reading, Shakespeare and Aristotle. I need to
Yeah.
slow my brain down too, right? But I think when I'm trying to read something that is substantive, that I can gain more out of as a human being, I'm going to go to the classics.
Yeah.
And the thing, I think the thing about where, artists are, this idea of starving artists, and artists are kind of, just fluff in our society. I don't know if this is going to be too highbrow or erudite, but I think that goes back to this argument of Plato and Aristotle, which everything I think can go back to this schism between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle valued the poets. He said the poets were more important than the histories of Herodotus even. But Plato said that it's the artists and poets who created a world that was this, sort of copy of this world that was already a copy. And he saw them as being, this sort of extra. And he actually saw them as being a waste of time, because if you were creating
he thought of them as very dangerous,
and he
because they
did, definitely,
because they keep in your mind, they kind of engender in the mind of the public alternative ways of organizing society in your life.
Right. And if you're a philosopher king, you can't spend your time on that. You need to work on getting to this higher level and stuff. And so this idea of the arts being sort of fluff and nice, well, that's nice, but I'm going to go get this job, and you can just, that's a weekend hobby. That goes back to Plato. So it's hard to erase $2,500 or 2,500 years of history, right? Of how people have been thinking. Because even in the Renaissance, as much as the arts were patronized and stuff, that was those were particular popes. Those were particular families and particular individuals in the families. Not every Medici was supporting the arts like Cosimo. So, we hear about these. We hear about like Pope Leo and supporting of the arts, but not every pope did that. So it's interesting.
Well, the broader, I think, concept you're bringing up is the idea of how we're shaped by forces outside of our knowledge or understanding if we don't read literature. Right. And I think there's something profound, like one of the profound reasons to study the classics in literature. And by literature, I mean drama, poetry, narrative. That's short stories, novelettes, novels. That's literature to me. That's the realm of literature. It's the realm of letters that you should be studying on. You should study a little bit in each of those and throughout all the eras. And one value is that you can see in this Renaissance era that you're talking about, when if you read some of the poetry of Petrarch and you read some of the plays at the time, and they didn't really have too many. Well, I know you have this view that novels were older than I think they are, but that they didn't quite have the novel exactly the way we have it, I guess. But they had lots of literature is the point. And you could see in reading the literature how they were shaped by their values, and how, because you could see there's no other, and this is, I think, part of what Aristotle is talking about in the Poetics, is that there's no other realm of human endeavor, human activity that puts into a solidified, examinal world, ability to examine a product that shows the inner and outer values of the things that people love, why they loved them, how they loved them, how they lived their lives, how they experience things. You don't get that even in really good history books. Like
it's true.
You get like when the wars happened, sometimes letters that they had, so you could see how they just maybe, describe, maybe they did. You could get a little taste of, oh, okay, I don't like this war, and you get it, but you don't get the same level of in-depth examination into the soul of an individual character that you do with
very true.
With literature. And I think if you see that, you can see that, how did people feel about the French Revolution during the 19th century, or 17, '89, and how did Europe react to that, and what did that do to the feelings and the thoughts and the experiences of the whole world? How did that shift into the 1800s? And you could see that, when you read the great romantic poets of that time, of course, like I know you on your show talk about the Lake District poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Southey, and you can get a taste for how people experience those in a way that no history book will quite ever grasp.
It's true. I mean, we'll throw in excerpts from Livy or Plutarch, and to kind of help with the story of Epaminondas, because one thing that we're very cognizant about is that we want to go to original sources. We don't want people's modern interpretations. We want students or kids to know, look, this is the original source. So if you read it in a textbook, I'll pick on my favorite, Howard Zinn. So if you're reading Howard Zinn and U.S. history, it's going to look very different than if you go back to the documents, because his interpretation is very much through a particular lens.
Yeah.
And so we like to go back to the primary sources of history, but to read the entire, sit down and read Plutarch it's interesting. He's talking about, these major generals and major figures in Greece and Rome, but it's still not as compelling.
There's a big difference between Plutarch's Caesar and Shakespeare's Caesar.
Absolutely.
And that, I think, is an important understanding of why literature is so valuable as a fiction. Why fiction is so valuable, because I love Plutarch. I think Plutarch gives a lot of great, insights into the lives of these people, but he's not drawing a dramatization of their life. And there's a value in seeing the moment of that betrayal et tu, Brutus, and like where it makes that real profound impact on the world. And you get it on a personal level of Caesar's betrayal and what, the speeches that they give, which aren't really in Plutarch, as I don't remember. It's all Shakespeare right there. And he may have mentioned, it's been a long time since I've read Plutarch, but Plutarch does a great job with Caesar and Alexander. Those are probably my favorite Plutarch that I've read. But it's just not the same as seeing Caesar laying next to his wife, her freaking out about it, which is in Plutarch, but not
definitely. And she. We did a unit where we actually combined them both. They read Plutarch Caesar, and then we had them read Shakespeare Caesar.
Oh, nice.
Which is a great exercise.
Yeah, I think that's great.
Here's the history, and Plutarch is still not 100%, but here's the Roman history. Here's Shakespeare's dramatization. Now, and then we ask them, or we teach the parents to ask them, do either a comparison, similarities, or a contrast, differences.
Yeah.
And what does Shakespeare accomplish? What does he do?
Yeah, because he really uses the same plot. Like it's very similar.
So similar, and the people are warning Caesar not to go to the Senate that day, including his wife, right?
Yeah.
And
in Plutarch
and in Shakespeare. They're warning him not to go. And he's like, no, I'll be fine.
Just so people understand, Plutarch wrote during ancient Roman times.
Right.
He's writing in what, 2 BC or something like that, or 200 BC? 200 BC?
No, he's like 180. He's writing a little. He's
80. That's what I meant. Yeah. He's after, obviously, because it's after Caesar. So, and Shakespeare's writing in the 1500s. 1500 years later, and so it's but they're very similar in terms of like plot, what's going on, the characters, but it's completely changed by primarily the language that he's using, by the use of his language. There's dialogue that's not quite in Plutarch, and just those, the touches, like you said, it's a good exercise. I've never done that, but I think it'd be really useful for junior high kids and such, high school kids, to do that exercise, to read Plutarch, read and then read.
It's just and it shows them what literature can do. So you can read a history, that's interesting, but then when you read this literary account, it comes so much more alive. And that's that's literature. That's what it does.
That is what it does. And I think it's, in returning to like you and I trying to convince people that it's valuable, because it's just such a challenge, because so many people will, like, I've rarely run into somebody who says it's not valuable. Everybody acknowledges why it's valuable. And yet, I asked them, okay, what was the last thing of classic literature you read? And they're like, I don't have time for that. Right. And it's like, and to me, it's like, okay, but when was the last time you went to the gym? Well, I go to the gym 2 hours every day. Right. It's like, right. Okay, but so you work out your body, you don't work out your mind in that realm. And it's like, well, work is hard. Okay, but it's not the same. Is it as challenging or challenging in the way that maybe helps you become a better person as you would in, reading literature? And there's like this view that it's so hard to get around with adults and why I think it's so important what you're doing in trying to reach kids early, and why we need a good education, because there is this view that, you basically set your character by 8th, 9th grade, and then you're done. So you don't need to read classic literature. Like what you read up to that point is it, because your character's set and you're not going to change anything. It's like, no, you can have dramatic changes in your life. In fact, a lot of great literature talks about that and shows like great changes in the life of a 30-year-old who goes through some radical situation, or, whatever, Don Quixote or something, who like later in life, just like, I'm going to go romantically, go fight the world and go fight everything and, see life as this wonderful thing. And it's like, you get, we don't have that view today that I don't think people have that fundamental view that they can improve their character and their experiences of life.
They absolutely can. I mean, we have a group of about 13 people. We call it the Salon. And before quarantine, they would come over to our house once a month, and we would have a topic, and we would sit around and talk about a great book or philosophy. And we're all learning from each other. People from all different walks of life. Some homeschooled their kids, some don't have kids, some still have young kids. And, we have people that, are professionals. We have people that are stay-at-home moms. So it's a very, it's a varied group of people, but we still learn from each other.
Well, that's why you learn from each other.
Exactly.
You're all like, bots, just duplicates of each other. You wouldn't learn anything. I mean, that's part of the point.
And we have different views politically. And so it's really nice to come together and, talk about things with our different perspectives, and then, try to figure some things out from some of this classic literature. Or someone may have an idea. I'm like, wow, I've never thought about that. I've taught Frankenstein for years, but that's incredible. I wish I would have known that when I was still in the classroom.
And I think this is what turns a lot of people off that are not, there's that idea that there's, you're either a literature minded person or you're a mathematical minded person, right? Left or right. And I think that's garbage. I don't think that's true at all. Yeah. I mean, a lot of the great mathematicians in history wrote beautiful prose, and I mean, Newton's, Principia or whatever is,
my gosh.
Which I haven't read, I've read passages of it, but from what I've seen of it is beautiful prose. Like he's wrote in beautiful Latin. And so it's like, there's obviously, it's not true that you're either scientifically minded or you're literarily minded. That's a new thing, which by the way, is one reason why you should read the great classics, because you'll see people engaging with that dichotomy, that there is the difference. And, going to what you're talking about with varying experiences and people coming together, people don't like it when it's separated by, because they view themselves as either left or right brain, science or literature. But the way I've learned to look at it in the last several years and studying this myself is, it's true that there's not a necessarily a right answer when you're reading a poem, watching a play, reading a novel. There's not like, 2 + 2 is 4, right? Or here's this geometrical equation or algebraic equation, and there's the answer. You input the answer, and it's A or B, or it's true, or right. They want
Right.
that linear, but I do think there is a meaning, for one, that there is some deep meaning. And what I think happens, and why I encourage people to do exactly what you're doing, the salon, and having conversations about a particular work of art, is the way I've learned it to look at it is like this artist, if it's a good artist, created like this object, and think of it like a house.
Right.
And a lot of times, you look at that thing and, Deanna will read it and she'll be talking about something. I'll be like, what the heck are you talking about? We're not talking about the same thing. This is completely different. And then I'll talk about it and, I'll engage with this. I'll look at this part. And then as we discuss further, this is what I've learned in doing something I call converse with verse, by talking to people about a poem. What I have discovered is that what happens over time, if you do it long enough, is you start to learn that you're both looking at the same image, the same object in reality, but you're in the back, you're looking at the back of the house, the garden, in the backyard, and you're looking at the chimney and everything. And I'm looking at it from the front, and I'm just looking at the door, the shingles or whatever around the front, the front windows and the garage and the tool shed in the garage. And it's like, we're both looking at the same house, but you're over here in the garden and I'm over here in the tool shed, right? And we just have to figure out how to kind of coalesce them. And that's
right. That's a really good analogy.
Yeah, and I think it's well, because it actually came to me when I was having a 3-hour conversation on a recording that's still, you can listen to this if you go way back in Troubadour Podcast lore history, like a year and a half ago. It was a conversation I had with a high school friend of mine who had just gotten finished up all of his training as a pediatric doctor.
Oh, wow.
And we talked about, I think it was Randall Jarrell poem, on a sick child. And I think it's Randall Jarrell. I'm trying to remember, but it's basically this poem, and it's about it's about talking to and experiencing a dying child. And one of the things we taught, it was very, this interesting conversation. One of the things, I looked at is that how he looked at it, my friend, as a doctor who deals with this at least on some level. Sometimes I've never dealt with that. He has to deal with that sometimes. It's part of his job. And how I looked at it, and like we were looking at it so differently, it seemed bizarre. But then as we kind of discussed, I saw his point of view when he was explaining how he interpreted some passage versus how I was interpreting it. And that's when I realized, oh yeah, I'm just seeing it from a different perspective. And once I got once I integrated it into the broader perspective or my personal perspective, it made way more sense. And the whole thing kind of clicked together more.
It's so true. One of the people in our salon, this is really his first sort of entrance into literature. And, he's middle-aged man, not to, be, saying his age or anything, but, he's older. He's got, an adult.
Well, if he's 50, he's middle-aged.
Yeah, he's got adult kids, right? But this is his first kind of deep dive into literature, and he's the one, he always has an interesting perspective because he he comes from more of an engineering type background. And this is all new to him, and it's like he's these new eyes. And I'm reading a lot of these works multiple times. If we're reading them for the salon, if I pick it's usually something I've taught because it's easier for me because I'm familiar with it. And then, so it's so fun to learn from people in that regard.
Yeah. And I think it adds to the understanding of what I was talking about earlier with that young woman who, wanted to call the cops on the guy who was calling her out. It adds to our deep integrated understanding, like really acting out this idea that everyone has their own inner world.
Right.
And that inner world is very deep and complex. And sometimes they don't even know why they do the things that they do. Right.
Right.
And when you understand that, you can, I'm not saying you have to forgive and just let everybody get away with anything, but you do get a sense that, she probably doesn't know why she did that in that moment. And, my point, I guess, is that the cliche word is empathy, right? You gain an empathy. And I'm just trying to find different ways of saying that because it's such a cliche and nobody ever, like everybody says that word and nobody really understands it or enacts it. And it's crazy, but this is what it means to empathize with somebody, is to see that there's an inner world that's not the same as yours. And, there is this sense that I get in talking to most people and listening to most people that everybody knows Kirk Barbera, have an inner world. My inner world is complex. It's difficult. It's challenging. It's varied. Right. I sometimes don't know why I do things that create, the reasons why I do them. And, I'm deep and people don't understand me. Right. But I don't think most people understand that other people have the same inner world. Right. And so when you're looking at someone like her, our first reaction is, oh, what a bee. Right. Right. Like, how could she do that? But maybe she was just terrified. And she was acting, maybe she knew she was wrong. She, she just kind of reacted out of emotion. She wasn't thinking at that time. She was like, someone's calling me out. Oh my God. Maybe something bad happened to her and who knows? The point is that, before we try to destroy people's lives, we should try to think about these things. And I just use that as a practical example of, she got fired. People had death threats with her. I mean, they've ruined her life, at least in the short term. Hopefully, as things settle down, she'll get her job back. Yeah. And it's like, this was crazy. But, that's just what I mean by the ability to understand that everybody has an inner world. And that's one deep value that you get in reading literature.
So I'm going to sound like my normal old-fashioned self here.
Go for it.
But I think, having lived in a world and going through high school pre-social media and living in a world now with social media, people think, usually high school is a pretty, you either love it or you hate it, but it's still a rough time. I don't care if you're like at the top of the pyramid or if you're at the bottom of the pyramid. High school tends to be rough for various reasons.
Yeah.
And so I think social media now makes the world a worse place because you can just hide behind, you can say something and run away, right? There's no face-to-face. And you hear these stories about, the African-American man going to the Deep South and talking to KKK members and, breaking down these barriers.
Yeah.
And I think those are beautiful. And what is happening, and it's, again, the lack of literature. And this is a big reason for it, is this backlash against the, dead old white guys.
Yeah.
Because of, oppression and all these other things that come out of postmodernism and modern education. And that's a whole other episode, so we're not going to go down there. But what literature does and what reading literature does is that it allows you the opportunity to regain your humanity and to understand other people's humanity. And I think that's what's missing.
Yeah.
I'm on social media for Pizan Academy. I rarely post anything personal because for my own sanity, I check out. I actually just built a literary garden.
Okay.
And
cool.
I have
what
plants.
Is that?
I have plants. We're going to do a video, so I don't want to reveal too much.
Okay.
But, I have plants based on literature in my garden. I've created this immersive space for me to have a place to read literature and feel like I'm immersed in some of my favorite books in the world.
Yeah, and I think there's so what literature does for you is elevate certain aspects of life.
Absolutely.
Right? Like it brings it to a higher level for you. And, a lot of people don't, I think, realize that will happen to them if they read good literature and they really start to understand it a little bit. And when I say read good literature, I don't mean spend all your time like you and I might do reading literature. I mean, you don't have time for that. It's not your full-time position. But I mean, if you're reading anything at all, you just, instead of reading, 2 or 3 modern books, just go pick one classic and try and read that. And then there's a lot of, one of the great things about living in 2020 is there's so much tutorials and, videos like what we're doing and Troubadour Podcast and Pizan Academy to kind of help people with that. I mean, when I'm doing this Milton course, I'm doing it with oh no, what is it? Is it Dartmouth? It's on edX, edX.com.
I've taken a lot of those courses, Future Learn. They're amazing.
They have some great stuff on there. I've done the Iliad. So we haven't talked about Iliad. I know that's our favorite book. That's a whole subject, but yeah, so like I've taken a whole bunch. Like I remember the first one I did was my favorite, and it was on fantasy and sci-fi literature by a guy from, oh man, I'm forgetting what school he's from, but anyway, it was a great course, and we read tons of literature. So I read along with him, just like it was a class. And that's one way to do it. It's like, well, you're busy, so you could do over 6 months, just chop it up and do this class and read, or a year, just read what he tells. A lot of it's short stories. Just read
or excerpts.
I mean, it's well, he might have had a few excerpts. It was actually mostly, read Frankenstein, like just read it. Read Dracula, just read the book, right? Don't read an excerpt, just read Dracula. It's not that big a book. It's not that long. So the point is that there's a lot of tools in 2020 to help you, do that. If you want to get some poetry, once a month, just, choose one that I have. I have like hundreds at this point. I just listen and you'll get something out of it. At least I hope you do. If there's, you do a lot of novels. So if you want to, get guidance on a novel, check out Pizan Academy, even as an adult, and do some of the stuff with them. And then of course, now for all you homeschool people, choose them for helping your guidance for, teaching your kids.
Yeah, we have an adult program. We're putting it on hold because we're doing a relaunch right now. But we have an adult program called the Explorers that we will be reactivating. And in that, we do the same kind of deep dive. Like we did the Scarlet Letter. And
I just read that again, by the way.
Oh, it's so good.
It's been a long time, but yeah.
With the Scarlet Letter, we talk about the sort of the history of the Puritans. And we go in and talk about the witch trials, even though it's not exactly related, it does relate to it. And then we also talk about John Locke, because he had a huge influence on Puritan thought.
Yeah.
And so this book is like put into full context. And it's so much fun to build it out that way for us.
Yeah.
And we're still learning, like we'll find a primary source. I'm like, wow, I had no idea that this trial was available now. And again, like you say, in 2020, there's so many free resources online. And so, we point to Project Gutenberg. If you want a free copy of Frankenstein's not up there, but if you want a free copy of Pride and Prejudice, go to Gutenberg.
Frankenstein's not in Gutenberg? What? Really?
I know. It's one of the few. Something with the copyright.
But it was 1819.
It was, but there's some, I don't know why it's not.
That's crazy. All right, sorry.
It's all right.
That's bizarre.
We found that out.
Yeah, that's bizarre to me. But okay.
Yeah.
All right.
It may be now. When we were working on it.
Okay.
Yeah. But Pride and Prejudice, is up there. And we just did a big unit on Pride and Prejudice where we talk about, the King Georges and the Regent and all of, that era, and put it into context. And then we talk about the arts and the dancing, because all of that comes alive in Jane Austen's novel. So why not have a deeper immersion? We have a cooking show. We just did an episode. We released an episode today where you can cook something from the novel if it's mentioned. Cool. And so it's an immersive experience. We did Red Badge of Courage, and the guy talks about pea soup and wanting to be home and having pea soup. So I made my mom's pea soup recipe.
That's
so
awesome.
It was fun. Yeah.
Yeah. I love that. And that's, I think it's, there's a lot of reasons to read these works, and this could be one good addition to have for it. And I always tell people, like, traveling is such a big deal for our society today. This is an example I use all the time. Traveling is such an important thing for our society, especially younger people. Like, all my friends basically wear badges of travel. Like, you're not cool unless you've traveled to 10 different locations on the planet, right?
Right.
If you haven't, gone diving in the Aegean Sea or something, you're not cool.
I know what you mean.
And it's like, okay, I get that. That's awesome. I admire that kind of commitment to traveling. But the thing that always fascinates me in talking to people, and I'm not a big traveler actually, mostly on this continent, on mostly America, Canada, Mexico. That's where I've mostly gone.
Right.
So at this point, I'm going to go many more places. But what's really fascinating to me about their experiences and talking to them is when I engage them and ask them questions, they are essentially doing the same thing on the streets of Paris that they do in their corners, when they're back home here in America, right? Like their home. They're doing very similar things to just the only difference is they're doing a little bit more partying because they don't have their job. But when they go party and go out in Austin, Texas here, they're acting and doing and experiencing things pretty much the same. And the story I always remember is a friend of mine was talking to me about, I think this is very common, right? They go and they take pictures of things and that's about it. But there'll be a payoff to what I'm telling you right now. So just when I was going with, or talking to a friend of mine, he was telling me the story of how he was in Paris and, he met these locals and he's a very outgoing, fun person. And so they invited him to, hang out with them. And they're walking down this old ancient cobblestone, road. Wow. They're in between these two ancient buildings. He sees these lights, these tinkling lights in the off at the end of the alley. There's like a little canopy of greenery, and he walks through this door, and there's all these people, and it's a party, and they're all like playing beer pong, and that's basically it. And it's like, and so basically, wow. And that's what he does, right? And it's like, I had another friend who studied abroad in Italy, and he lived across the street from the Vatican, and he never went to the Vatican. And it's like, and my point is like, wow. I think people go traveling and they are the same people they were when they left. So that makes sense. Like we value traveling not really to, although people pay lip service to this, but not really to go to different places, experience different cultures, but to just go there and to say we experienced them. Because if we really were serious about experiencing other cultures, the only real way to do that is to read literature. Like I could talk to you all day. I'll never really understand you if I don't read American literature. Like, it's true. And how you were shaped by the culture, that's one that's on your TV, right? Like the things that are beaming, that's what you get your ideas from. The terminology is infected by ideas, and that's not the best terminology these days, but that idea of like really exploring and what John Keats said, traveling in the realms of gold, that's a form of traveling. And if you don't do that, and then you travel, you're not really traveling. You're just taking yourself and being the same person you're just in Italy playing beer pong.
It's geography, right? It's not travel.
It's just not the same thing.
I think you and I are a lot similar in that. Like before I went to Paris the first time, I was reading books about Paris before I went, but I was reading the literature. I was listening to Edith Piaf. I wanted to, emerge. So when I went there,
it's a different experience.
It was completely rich. And I mean, I spend all my times in museums. I spend all the time in museums. So when you were talking about your friends, I'm like, well, I guess I am the same person when I go over there, because I want to immerse myself in culture and literature and beauty and gardens. And that's what I do when I travel. I want to, feel like I'm part of something. But, most people I don't think go through life like that. My husband is always, rewriting my emails. He's like, people aren't always, they can't relate to that because you're, I'm like, I know I'm different. I'm nerdy or whatever you want to label it.
Yeah.
A nice way is a passionate valuer, is what I like to say.
Well, but I even mean something, related to that. And it's you go to Italy and we know that they're very touchy-feely, passionate, loud people, but at least that's the cliche of them.
Right.
But if the question is reading their literature, looking at their painting, looking at the beautiful art and how they appreciate, art in a different way and appreciate sensuality in a way that's really sometimes off-putting to some, conservative Americans, for instance.
Right.
And so there's one thing to go to Italy and see that, to actually meet I dated a girl and she was like in college. She actually, you know, I won't say more details, but she like spent some time with a real life troubadour, like a
Oh,
guy who
wow.
went around with a little ukulele and a cape and like actually serenaded people on the streets. And she like spent time with him. And, like that's not something you see really often in America. New York
No.
City, you might see some things like that.
Right.
But the point is that you're getting this. It's one experience to experience that and to say, oh, that's an experience. But it's another experience to kind of dig into the art a little bit. And, before
Right.
you get there, to kind of enrich and really elevate your understanding and your experience with seeing that, to see why they're like that, to see the kinds of values, how the mind body dichotomy, for instance, the view of the mind is, or the body is more valuable than the mind or something, right? You're more
Right.
essential. And that idea that's been played out since Aristotle and Plato has manifested itself in every different way possible. And when you go to different cultures, it's another way to kind of solidify it in your mind and to enrich that experience. It's like, oh, so the Italians are like this, the Parisians are like this, the Ethiopians are like that, right? And it's like people in Denmark, they act like this, and it's like it's related to these kind of, we might think of them as a little bit more uptight and stuffy or something, and it's like these kind of characters, and that's the kind of things that they're and that adds to the experience. It's not just like being able to quantify it, but it really enriches your just like getting to know somebody. You get to know them more when they reveal more about their soul and why they are the way they are.
It's absolutely true. And in literature, these authors and writers, I mean, that's what they're doing. They're revealing their soul in the context of their own time. And so, if you would like to travel, reading something from the Middle Ages, well, boom, you're a time traveler,
Yeah.
right? So if you're, reading the Canterbury Tales, which are really good and very funny.
Yeah.
So, but then you're going back, and if you understand why they were written, like what the purpose was and how that was a normal thing in the Middle Ages during Chaucer's time, making that pilgrimage to Canterbury.
Yeah.
It's just really interesting to think about.
Yeah, and it tells you about that culture in a way that history can't. And
Like
that's,
I
I
said,
think,
the only
the
way I know to
takeaway.
say it is humanizes it.
It humanizes it. Yeah. I mean, it individualizes it, it humanizes it, and it brings it into stark reality to see these countervailing forces in a work of art that you don't see as clearly in history. Because history, as Aristotle pointed out, has to be about what actually happened, whereas art can be about what ought to be, or that's one interpretation of what, a more abstract version. Like, so as an artist, I can take this counter, like innocence and experience is a big part of the Romantics, right? It's what Blake's poetry is about. And he had a view of like that view of innocence and experience, and they think of the French Revolution as the loss of innocence, the reign of terror, right? They had this excitement, but then it was like this reign of terror. And so there was a kind of loss of innocence, and you can see that in studying their work and reading the works of the Romantics in particular, and how they worked on those two topics. What is innocence? What's the value of it? Should we protect it? What does it look like in real life? And then how does that apply to us today? Right. And are we innocent? Are we experienced? Are we, determined by that? Are we challenging ourselves in that way? And I just think there's something irreplaceable that at least nobody has replaced it today in literature, in getting those views in our minds so that we can better understand them for ourselves and how they shape us.
Absolutely. When people talk about great literature, they're like, again, they think of those ivory towers. That's only people who are getting an English degree or something. And it's hard to get past that. And, we talked about the great books, and I was I have to admit, a bad literary snob. I didn't read anything from the 20th century for a very long time. And then I read, I kind of had this Dorothy Parker Algonquin Round Table phase in my 20s, and I read a little bit of Hemingway, but other than that, I didn't really read anything 20th century. I liked a couple poets from the early 20th century, but I didn't. And then I met my husband almost 10 years ago, and he's like, read this. I'm like, okay. And so I started reading, I had my first experience with reading an Ayn Rand novel. I opened up and I've read some things, like I just read Shane by Jack Schaefer. And these are things I would never have picked up because I was that person. And I try to, I'm doing better at opening things up. I didn't read Harry Potter for a very long time. The only reason I read it is when I finished my doctorate, I was exhausted mentally and physically. And I was summertime and I wanted something before I went back to teaching. And I was like, well, whatever. These are going to be stupid. I'll just pick them up. They were amazing. And I would put them in classic literature.
Oh,
and
wow.
I would categorize them because there are things that make something classic. And
this is a whole topic.
It is.
Because I wouldn't agree with that, by the way, but go ahead.
But I mean, I would in 100 years, they're going to be classics.
Okay, so then I would because for me, time is an essential component. And it has to have at least 100 years.
And for
of
me,
being renewed by people, because that's the thing that, because like there's the woman who wrote The Secret Garden.
Oh yeah.
Do you know that she wrote books that were the equivalent of Harry Potter at her time?
No, I didn't.
She had a very popular series of books about a young boy who had magical powers, something like that. I haven't read them. I just read when I was reading about her. I learned that.
Yeah.
And we don't remember any of those. We remember Secret Garden, right? And so those are not classics. They're not in the canon. Secret Garden is. And so, I don't know. I love Harry Potter books. I think they're great, but I don't know that they have the profundity of language and theme that will last the test of time.
I think
but we'll see. We'll see.
I think that they do. I wish I had that, way back machine that could also go forward and we could we could hash this out. But there are universals in there. There are things.
Yes,
there are heroes to look up for. There are that this is right behavior, this is wrong behavior. There are those elements of what we would call within the classic canon. Now, you're right. I wouldn't call them a classic today. I could see them being in that canon.
Yeah.
In 100 years.
Yeah, so I mean, there's no way of knowing. I like them. I don't want to, disparage them. I really enjoy them. I just, I don't see anything unique enough about them. Like Secret Garden, they had that kind of one of the theme and the plot was somewhat unique, but I think the big thing that people take out of that in terms of classic is the dialect that she kind of, captures in written form. And that's, one thing that made that book really famous, I think, in terms of worthy of study, because that's part of what I think has to happen is there has to be a recapturing of it every generation. So, will Harry Potter be popular with my kids? That'll be the question, or at least read on some level with my kids. And if not, then I don't know. Like you talked about Ayn Rand, she's becoming popular because she's every new generation so far rediscovers her. And to me, even though I love Ayn Rand, I'm barely willing to say she's classic yet.
I wouldn't put her. I don't think she's.
I think she will be though. I think so. I know she will be. I should say she's proven it over and over again. But I just think that there needs to be a you and I are looking at from Iliad and Odyssey. We're talking thousands of years is the kind of scale and scope that we require. So I think 75, 100 years are minimum for something to become classic.
Yeah.
But
I usually say about
a lot of signs.
Yeah.
Hundreds. I think 100. But with Harry Potter, like I don't know, are kids really reading them this generation? Like the Gen Z?
They're still being sold. They're still being read. Yeah. I talked to homeschool moms that are,
still gaga.
Yeah.
I think it'll be, for me, the determining factor will be like when I'm in my 60s. If kids are reading it then I'm like, all right, yeah, we're good. That's a good sign.
She was right.
Well, I know she's right. I know it's a good work, but I mean, what makes something a classic is a complicated subject because like I said, why do people re-pick it up. Because here's the danger. If, in terms of her stuff, if someone in 5 years writes something that's equally, similar, more updated, and, of the same kind of power that hers had and the simplicity of it, then that could overtake Harry Potter.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't. There have been things that have been popular. There are other movies that have been made, like the Aragon series, although that came out kind of at the same time.
That doesn't even compare in popularity.
I know, but I'm just saying, there are things that have been popular. I don't know if they'll be, I think that there are themes, just universal themes, and there are interpretations of the human condition in Harry Potter that you don't see in most modern literature. And I think that's why it would be a classic.
Possibly. I think we could argue that, but it's an interesting conversation to have one day.
Yeah.
Because there's other things. And I'm not saying it won't. Like I said, I'm not saying that Harry Potter won't. So, but
we'll put it on our calendar for 40
exactly.
years.
Yeah, put it because it's what makes a classic.
Yeah,
is an important subject.
It's a big question because there are lost classics that we're looking at from the late 1800s.
Yeah.
That were written that are very heroic, but they're kind of in obscurity now, and they were at the height, but we're looking at them for our heroes units just to bring in some other perspectives and other voices that would go along with the traditional classics. So it could be an interesting experiment.
That's very helpful too. Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, great. So, Deanna, thank you for joining us today. Any last things about Pizan Academy before we sign off, and what you're trying to do and where we can find you and talk to you?
Yeah. So we are PizanAcademy.com, PISAN Academy.com. It's named after a Renaissance woman who advocated for the education of girls and brought humanism to the French court. So one of my heroes. So I named my company after her. And we provide literature curriculum for homeschooling parents, focusing particularly on middle school and high school, although we are going to start doing some works for grammar school as well. So PizanAcademy.com, and we're launching our new website on June 1st.
Okay, so it'll still be PizanAcademy.com.
It'll still be, the same URL, everything. We're just revamping it.
Okay,
New and improved, yeah.
I like it. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time, and hopefully we'll have you back on the show soon.
Yes, that would be fun.